Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would now like you to introduce Elba Manzanilla. She's a lawyer from Venezuela and is specializing in European law. And she's going to talk with us about the EU markets and the differences and similarities.
Der nächste Speaker. Partner mein Name. Ist meine
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, and congratulations on organizing such a wonderful event. I am originally from Venezuela, but currently I am living in Barcelona and I work in Barcelona. I am a lawyer by background, currently heading the European coverage of CBD-Intel, which I will tell you more about in a bit. Today I will be speaking about CBD regulatory approaches in the EU. How are they different? How are they similar? So I will try to do more of an overview instead of a country-by-country rundown. CBD-Intel is a B2B market data and legal tracking service. So we have an international focus. We are focused in Europe, but we are also doing the US and other international markets. As I said before, we are based in London and in Barcelona. We are roughly a team of 30 analysts. And all the content that we produce is published in our web platform, which is CBD-Intel, which you can see right there. We have a sister publication that is called eSig Intelligence. It is the leading data provider for the vaping sector. We are very well known in that area, and we have a reputation for objective analysis. That is why we have managed to work with players from the private sector, but also public entities. We have worked with the FDA in the US, the Food and Drugs Administration, and we have worked with the European Commission as well. About a year ago, we started to get into CBD, basically because of all the parallels with the vaping sector. Many of our clients started to express their interest in this sector and started to get into it. Both topics have a lot in common. From a policy perspective, they are both very controversial, and we have developed methodologies tracking the e-cigarette sector that we are now applying to the CBD sector. As the market grows, we are expecting more legislation to come into place, which is very interesting for us and why we are tracking this sector, and I will talk about that more later on. So this is my agenda for today. I will talk about three things, basically. I will first draw a global context for CBD. Then I will go further into EU regulation. I will try to explain what are the main issues there. And I will finish off with a couple of conclusions and a couple of insights of what we can expect in the near future. So where does CBD sit within general cannabis legislation? CBD is generally not considered a narcotic. This means that the regulatory framework that applies for recreational cannabis adult use does not really encompass CBD. So what about medical legislation? CBD is not always a medicine, so this doesn't cover it exactly. For us, CBD sits more within a middle ground between those two. It does have to do with the medical sector, but there's also a recreational component. We like to think of it as very related just to the health and wellness sector. So it is very much a middle ground. Why do we think that CBD is the big opportunity here in Europe? Basically, the way that regulation has evolved in the US and more recently in Canada It's not really matched anywhere else, and especially not here in Europe. On the medical marijuana side, regulation does tend to develop very slowly. Patients need to be registered, physicians need to adhere to this type of programs. So in general, medical marijuana legislation does tend to be more restrictive. So that is why we think that CBD is the main entry point for the cannabis sector in Europe. In the EU, hemp farming is the main exception to cannabis as a narcotic. Once CBD is extracted from hemp, pure CBD is basically majorly unregulated unless it gets sucked into pharmaceutical legislation, which may happen. In which cases does CBD get sucked into medical legislation? It is possible that because of the way the product is marketed, that medicine legislation will apply. This means that if a product is advertised as for curing a disease, it will be sucked into medical legislation, which is a highly restrictive regime. There is another case in which CBD may be considered a medicine. It is possible that a certain government may deem CBD to be, because of its inherent properties, a medicine in all cases. So this is rare, but we do have some international examples of how this is happening. Brazil, for example, and Australia is another example. What does this mean actually for the CBD market? Well, it does mean that this is a consumer-driven market. It is mainly growing because of word of mouth, because producers are very restricted from freely advertising the benefits of their own product, which is very different to the way other industries develop. As the market continues to grow, we think that more regulation is likely to come. Now, is that a good thing? We will talk about it more later on. Now, in Europe, what is the general situation? So there is not one specific product regulation that encompasses the whole CBD sector. We have a patchwork of regulations. As a raw substance, I said it before, the substance is majorly unregulated. There are some outstanding examples. For example, Slovakia, I think, is the only European country in which CBD is a scheduled controlled substance. We have another outstanding example in Europe, which is Sweden, which is deeming CBD as a medicine in many cases. In regards to the source of CBD, we have a European industrial hemp framework. This framework is very wide. I will talk about it later on, but it really is just down to member states how they regulate the source of CBD. In terms of consumer products, so CBD products that are directed to be as end products, basically a different regulatory regime will apply depending on the product's intended use. So for foods, we have food regulation, food supplement regulation, of course, including the novel food regulation, which you already heard extensively about. In regards to topicals, we have the EU cosmetics regulation, and we could even have the tobacco products directive apply. Since we're talking about consumer products, I do want to talk a bit about CBD product diversity. This sector is highly fragmented. Product variation is huge when compared to other individual substances such as nicotine, which makes it a very difficult sector to regulate. So, of course, we know that top product types are oils, e-liquids, edibles, but we have a very wide range. I mean, CBD hummus, that is definitely my favorite example here. We'll talk now more about EU regulation specifically. So let's start with the source of CBD. And here I want to talk about implementation by the member states, because as I said before, there is a European-wide industrial hemp framework, but this doesn't really regulate much. It leaves a lot of discretion to member states in terms of what they can do and how they can implement that legislation. So what does the European framework do? It basically establishes the regulatory requirements for hemp farmers to obtain financial aid from the EU. How can hemp farmers in the EU do that? Well, basically they need to plant registered plants that are registered within the EU plants variety database, and the THC content may not exceed 0.2%. Now this is a percentage that currently applies, but there is some movement at European level for this to increase eventually to 0.3. That is basically what is regulated at European level. But what is happening at member state legislation? A lot. So we have a lot of variation in regards to what each specific country is doing. For example, the THC trace, we have an outstanding example in Italy where the crop may have a tolerated THC trace of up to 0.6%. In terms of notifications and licenses, this also isn't set at European level. Each member state does a different thing. So while some member states might say you need a license to grow hemp, in others you just need to register your crops. It's just a very much more lenient framework. In terms of manufacturing, it varies a lot. Many countries do restrict the parts of the plant that can be used for manufacturing. For example, France. The use of industrial hemp is restricted basically to the fibers and the seeds. This is being challenged. This is an interesting example because it is being challenged at national courts, and this national court elevated the question to the European Court of Justice to see if this is in line actually with European regulation. Now, once CBD is extracted from hemp, we believe this is a requirement that is very difficult to enforce, but there are some examples of evidence of provenance being required. In terms of the regulation that applies to CBD end products, of course I cannot tackle here all the examples, but we will try to address some of the main issues, right? So for foods, we have the Novel Food Regulation. What does the Novel Food Regulation pursue? Well, it basically wants to control new foods that come onto the market when their safety is not really proven with a history of consumption. Now, is hemp-derived CBD a novel food? Well, that is the big question. There is a lot of discussion at European level. We have the European Novel Food Catalog, which is supposed to be an agreed position between all member states, but this is anyway being interpreted differently at member state level, and we have seen sudden changes to the catalog. So even when last year the stand was CBD, if it's enriched, it may be problematic, but full spectrum products with naturally occurring quantities of CBD are okay. Most recently, the catalog was changed to say that all extracts would qualify as novel. Now, this is a problem, the sudden changes in interpretation. We have seen enforcement efforts throughout Europe in various degrees, which I will also talk about more later on. So, topicals regulation. Topicals in the EU are governed by EU cosmetics regulation. So again, there is nothing to apply here. This is a product-specific regulation, but it is interpreted by member states when they apply this regulation. So what is the problem here? What is the main issue? If EU authorities are saying that the flower, the hemp flower, may be problematic when used as a source of CBD, because the EU regulation makes a reference to cannabis extracts as defined in the International Convention for Narcotics. Of course, this is a very ambiguous text. It's very difficult to know how exactly it will be interpreted. In terms of vaping products, this is also a very interesting example because there is crossover with vaping legislation, and in some member states we have the Tobacco Products Directive applying to this sort of products. So even though we have the Tobacco Products Directive that only regulated nicotine-containing products, many member states took that regulation further and applied it to nicotine-free products as well. So what does this mean for CBD vaping products? Well, basically that they might operate in some member states under a restricted environment, which would mean labeling requirements, which would mean product ingredients restrictions, which would mean, it could even mean a tax applicable to this type of products. Enforcement. This is a very important section, of course, because all that we have talked about, what is the practical reality? The reality is that the constant regulatory change leads to sudden clampdowns, leads to sudden enforcement efforts that are very difficult to foresee. In many cases, they are based on government criteria that can change from one day to the other or could be challenged at national courts. An outstanding example is again France, where a couple of months ago, well, a few months ago already, many shops were closed and are now starting to reopen again because local courts found that there was actually no violation with the local drug laws. So what are the consequences of everything that I have said here? I have painted a very fragmented picture, which is what I wanna come across. So what is the practical reality? What are the consequences? It's a very complex regulatory situation, which is very difficult for companies to navigate on their own. Legal uncertainty. Well, if we don't know the rules of the game we are playing, it is very difficult to anticipate, to prepare, and to plan ahead. Sudden clampdowns. Of course, this does not make a very stable environment to run a business in. Cowboys and free riders. Well, there is a part of the sector that is just taking advantage of the hype of the regulatory legal void to produce bad quality products, mislabeling, and so on. This does a lot of harm, actually, to the part of the industry that does want to be professional. Policymakers are slow to catch up. Well, legislation in general is slow to catch up. But because of the nature of the CBD market, it is a fast-growing market. Legislation will be, again, slow to catch up, and we are more likely to see more interpretations and more guidelines instead of hard law. So as the market grows, governments will start to pay more attention to see how they can control this product better. Regulation is likely to come. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? Really, it can be both. It can be a good thing because inevitably standardization will come. So competitors will have a more level playing field. Everyone will need to adapt to the same sort of requirements, and product quality will be ensured. So no more having a business in the Wild West, as it is called. Is it a bad thing? Well, that is the balance that basically needs to be maintained. Countries should stay away from regulation that would actually kill off the market and heavily restrict the access to consumers of the product. What do we think is likely to happen? Well, a CBD products directive is very unlikely at European level, so we do think that the regulatory developments will come at member state level, which will mean that the sector will continue to be fragmented. However, if regulation starts to develop, we believe that will be a good thing because the legal question mark around the CBD sector will inevitably disappear, and we will hopefully transition into a more professional market, and the sector will continue to grow at a more steady pace. Thank you very much.